Which is the worst starter choice in Pokemon Red and Blue? It's Bulbasaur. I should clarify though, I mean the worst for playing the single player games with. I do not mean for competitive multiplayer or which you might like the most. Picking Bulbasaur because it's your favorite is absolutely legitimate. Let's compare the base stats of the three starter Pokemon and their evolved forms. If you just do a quick comparison, you might use the base stat total as a shortcut. And with that comparison, you would think that Bulbasaur is the best, because it has more base stat total than Charmander or Squirtle. And after they evolve, the base stat totals are the same, with 325 for the second evolution stage, and 425 for the third evolution stage. But base stat total is just a quick summary. It's not how the game actually works. The thing that actually matters is which base stats the Pokemon gets, and the base stats are not equally valuable. Pokemon's base stats are different than the stats that are used for calculations in battle, but the base stats are part of a complicated formula that helps determine their actual stats. So just for the sake of comparing which Pokemon is better, we can compare base stats. So, what do these stats actually do? Well, a pretty simple one is hit points. It just determines the number of hit points the Pokemon gets, which they get a different number than the numbers listed here, but it's influenced by this. So if you have more base stats for hit points, you get more hit points. So that's a good base stat. You normally want more hit points, but all three of them get similar enough numbers that that's not really the main thing determining which is better or worse. Another is speed. That's a pretty simple one. In Pokemon, you get turns, and well, someone goes first. So it could be you or it could be your opponent. And if your speed stat is better than your opponent's speed stat, you go first. If your opponent's speed stat is better than your speed stat, your opponent goes first. But the base stat speed also does something else. It's not the Pokemon's actual speed stat that does this, but the base stat speed affects the Pokemon's critical strike chance. So if your base stat speed is better, you get more critical strikes chance. But if you get more speed some other way, it does not give you more critical strike chance. Critical strikes are normally good because they deal more damage than other regular hits. But they also ignore in-battle stat changes, so if you're doing something really complicated, critical strikes can be bad. How is the damage that you do with a regular move calculated? Well, if you're using a move of a physical type, so some types of moves are physical and, well, Pokemon start knowing a normal move mostly, so like at the start of the game you know a normal type move, and that's a physical type, so then the way it's calculated is, well, something involving your attack. So more attack means you do more damage, and your target's defense stat. So more defense for them means they take less damage from the physical move. So attack's a pretty useful stat if you're using physical moves. But if you're not using physical moves, it's kind of irrelevant. And defense is a useful stat if your opponents are using physical moves. And at the beginning of the game, most opponents use physical damaging moves. So defense is a pretty useful base stat. Okay, so what about special? Well, remember I said a move of a physical type? Well, some types of Pokemon moves are physical types, and some types are special types. And if you use a special type, you don't use attack or defense, instead you just use special for both. So you could think of special as special attack and special defense, and actually in later Pokemon games they split the stat. Because special helps offensively and defensively, I think that it's the best of these base stats. And Bulbasaur is the one with the better special. So, well, if you pick Bulbasaur, I think your base stats are better than the other options, even after it evolves. But this only really matters if someone, you or your opponent, is using a damaging move of a special type, which happens pretty much later in the game, but not so much around the beginning. So realistically, it's the worst at the beginning of the game for the base stats, and its base stats are the best later. Let's compare the starter Pokemon's types. Type matters two ways. If a Pokemon uses a damaging move, and the type of that move is the same as the Pokemon's type, that move will get same type attack bonus, which means the move does about 1.5 times as much damage. Type also matters defensively. When a damaging move is used against a Pokemon, sometimes the damage is modified if the type of the move used and the type of the Pokemon that it hits are right. This chart summarizes how that works. Let's compare the starter Pokemon offensively first. For now, I'll make it simple and only consider their same type attack bonus move, so Grass, Water, and Fire. Grass is super effective against 3 types and not very effective against 6 types. Water is super effective against 3 types and not very effective against 3 types. Fire is super effective against 3 types and not very effective against 4 types. Just from this, it would seem like Grass is the worst of these types offensively. But if you consider what you actually encounter in the game, you could make an argument that Fire is less useful than Grass as an offensive type. Okay, let's compare Water and Grass now. They're kind of similar types. So if you compare against most types of Pokemon, it's either they look like equal or Water is better than Grass against that type. The only exception is if your opponent is a Water type. Then Grass is the better offensive type than Water, but only against Water types. Now let's compare the starters defensively. Most of the time, Charmander is the worst defensively just from the base stats, with some exceptions against certain types of moves. Next, we compare Bulbasaur and Squirtle defensively. If we consider their base stats and their types, Bulbasaur is the better defensive option against fighting type moves, water type moves, grass type moves, and electric type moves. If we're being really generous to Bulbasaur, we can also include poison type moves and dragon type moves. But Squirtle is the better defensive option against every other type of move. Poison type moves actually deal more damage to Bulbasaur than to Squirtle, but some poison type moves can apply the poison status condition, which normally won't affect Bulbasaur but would affect Squirtle. And that's the only reason that Bulbasaur might be better against poison type. Bulbasaur has slightly more base hit points than Squirtle, so Bulbasaur is better against fixed damage moves. 2 fixed damage moves exist in Generation 1. One of them is only learned by electric types, so I think that's already handled. And the other is a dragon move. So I consider Bulbasaur better against an entire type entirely because a single move where it is a negligible difference. Let's summarize this. If we're being very generous to Bulbasaur, it's better defensively against 6 types of moves, and Squirtle is better defensively against the other 9 types of moves. So, Squirtle seems like the better defensive Pokemon. But what if we consider what you actually encounter in the game? The types that Squirtle is better against are mostly more common anyway, so Squirtle is almost definitely the better defensive Pokemon. Next, let's compare what moves the starter Pokemon and their evolved forms learn. For now, I'll only consider what moves they learn from levels, and assume that you let the Pokemon evolve when they try. You can get some moves a bit sooner if you delay their evolution. Let's start with Squirtle, Wartortle, and Blastoise. You get mostly damaging moves, but you also get Tail Whip, which reduces the enemy's defense, and Withdrawal, which increases your defense. Bite is a bit better than it looks because it includes a 10% chance the enemy skips their turn, and Skull Bash is much worse than it looks because it's a 2-turn attack. But the rest are nice and simple. Charmander starts with Scratch and Growl. Scratch is better than Tackle, with more power and accuracy. Growl reduces the opponent's attack, which is useful in a couple battles. Then you get Ember, which is the same power and accuracy as Water Gun, but Ember includes a 10% chance that you apply the burn status condition to the opponent. Burn is pretty nice since it reduces their attack and deals a little bit extra damage. So Ember is better than Water Gun, but you also get Ember sooner than Water Gun. It's actually only one level later than Squirtle would get Bubble, so that's better. Leer and Rage are normally not good moves for Charmander, but then you get Slash, which it might not look so great, but Slash is a critical strike move. So it's a 70 power critical strike, which is really strong. And then Flamethrower, which again, it's a fire type move that includes a 10% chance of a burn. Blastoise doesn't get an equivalent move from levels, but let's be fair. You can get the Surf HM from the Safari Zone, and it's required for regular game progression anyway, so let's assume that you used it. It's much like Flamethrower. Same power, same accuracy, but no chance of a burn, so it's worse. Unless the type difference matters. Let's assume that you don't use Fire Spin because you get it too late. Anyway, Charmander's moves are mostly just better than Squirtle's, except that maybe Water type could be more useful than Fire type sometimes. Bulbasaur starts with Tackle and Growl. That's worse than what Charmander had, but Squirtle also started with Tackle, so that seems fair. Then Bulbasaur gets Leech Seed. It's a move that takes away 1/16 of the opponent's health every turn and heals you for the same amount. Not 1/16 of your health, I mean the same number of health that the opponent lost. It's not very good because 1/16 is just not enough. In later games, it was buffed, but in Generation 1 games, Leech Seed is really weak. And you actually get the same problem with Poison Powder, that it does the same damage as Leech Seed, but it doesn't heal you, and it's less accurate. It's kinda just plain worse. Although you may notice I skipped a move. After you get Leech Seed, but before Poison Powder, you get Vine Whip. Vine Whip is kinda like Water Gun and Ember, but it's less power, the same accuracy, and less power points. Now, if you consider that Bulbasaur's special stat is better than Charmander's or Squirtle's, it's pretty close to the same damage, so instead of the better stats letting Bulbasaur actually do more damage, you just compensate for it with worse moves. So, okay, similar damage output, same accuracy, but less power points. Yeah, Vine Whip is still a worse move. And you get it later than Ember and only 2 levels before Water Gun. And if you consider the Water Gun TM available, it might even be later than that. Razor Leaf is a critical strike move, so that's 55 power critical strike damage. That's pretty good. We should also consider the level. Ivysaur learns Razor Leaf much earlier than Charizard learns Flamethrower. I also think now's a good time I should mention the evolution levels. For the first form to middle form, all of them evolve level 16, so that's not any different. And for middle form to final form, well, you get Blastoise or Charizard level 36, but you get Venusaur only level 32. So that's another advantage. So the big advantage if you pick Bulbasaur is you get your end game power sooner than you do if you pick the other starters. But which is stronger once you get it? I will compare Razor Leaf to Flamethrower and Surf. Razor Leaf is a critical strike move, and critical strikes ignore in-battle stat changes. Let's assume you're not doing any changing your stats in battle yourself, but we should still consider the badge boost. Since Razor Leaf ignores the badge boost for special, we should compare Venusaur's special without the badge boost to Blastoise or Charizard's special with the badge boost. Because Venusaur's base special is a little better, it's actually pretty close to the same. So again, Venusaur's better special is not really helping it do any more damage. Critical strikes also deal increased damage. It's slightly less than double, but a 55 power move critical strike still does more than a 95 power move that doesn't critical strike. But Razor Leaf can miss more often than the others. And, well, Razor Leaf, you automatically crit, but with Surf or Flamethrower, you sometimes crit and then you do more damage than Razor Leaf. And Flamethrower also sometimes applies a burn. So I think overall, they're pretty close to equally good moves. Since Razor Leaf has more power points, I'll let that be the tiebreaker, so I'll call it slightly better, but it's really close. Then Venusaur learns Growth, a move that increases your special stat. This does not help Razor Leaf, because critical hits ignore in-combat stat changes. And this is a total trap. A player that doesn't know the game very well might think that Growth and then Razor Leaf seems like a good idea, but it doesn't work that way. However, Special is also a defensive stat, so Growth still does help you survive against damaging moves of special types. Then you get Sleep Powder, a move that applies the status condition Sleep to your opponent. That is really good, because sleep is a very useful status condition. But that level requirement is ridiculous. If you got the level for Sleep Powder, you probably can already beat most opponents with a single hit of a damaging move anyway, which is just better. Solar Beam is a 2-turn attack, so it's a bad move with an even more ridiculous level requirement. Just ignore it. Time for a bit of a practical comparison. The game has some trainers in it, and you can battle against them, but there's so many it would be too tedious if I compared them all individually. So I'll summarize about the regular trainers. Bulbasaur does the worst overall against regular trainers because it has so many bad type matchups, some of which are really bad. But this mostly just makes it a bit more tedious, not too difficult, because these battles are generally pretty easy anyway. Now let's compare some battles against special trainers. The first special trainers are the rivals. It might be the same person or several different people with the same name. I don't know the lore of this game. But for the rival battles, well, for the first couple, you'll do the worst with Bulbasaur just because you don't really know any special moves and your opponents don't either, so the special stat is kind of irrelevant, and the other stats of Bulbasaur are the worst of the 3 starters. Later, the rival adds more Pokemon to their team. The first Pokemon they add was a Pidgey, which is later replaced by a Pidgeotto, then a Pidgeot. I don't know for sure whether these are the same Pokemon that just evolved or the rival just catches different Pokemon. Anyway, it's a flying type, so Blastoise does really well with an ice move, but Venusaur wouldn't do so well. A grass type is a bad matchup against a flying type. The rival also gets a grass type and a water type and a fire type. They get the starter with a type advantage against yours, then later they get the other 2 of Gyarados, Growlithe, and Execute. Gyarados is way stronger than Growlithe or Execute. And also, Gyarados is part flying type. So grass moves aren't actually good against Gyarados. Plus, Gyarados likes using moves that aren't water type, so if you picked a Bulbasaur as your starter, you don't actually do so well against Gyarados. Water type Pokemon do really well against the rival because they learn water moves and ice moves, which are very useful here. But the rival battles are probably actually the easiest if you picked a Charmander, just because your rival doesn't get a Gyarados. And they're the hardest if you picked Bulbasaur. You got the type disadvantage against most of their Pokemon, including their strongest Pokemon, the Psychic type, Alakazam. Yeah, Psychic moves are super effective against Grass Poison type Pokemon like Bulbasaur, and Alakazam is one of the strongest Pokemon in the game, and they get it, so that's just really bad if you picked a Bulbasaur. The rival also had a Rattata and Eradicate for 2 earlier battles, but since those are normal types, the starters get about equally good matchups against them. And the rival's final Pokemon is a Rhyhorn, which I guess Charmander does a little bit worse against, but really it's easy for all 3 starters. So the conclusion is Charmander does best against the rival, then Squirtle, then Bulbasaur. Some other special trainers are the gym leaders. The first is Brock, a trainer with 2 rock-ground type Pokemon. Water and grass are 4 times super effective against rock-ground types. And Squirtle actually is great. It learns its first water move, Bubble, when it's only level 8, which is good enough against this gym, and a casual player will be level 8 before they enter the gym. But a casual player might not be level 13 before they enter this gym, and that's when Bulbasaur learns its first grass-type damaging move, Vine Whip. So, Bulbasaur is not actually so great against this gym, but Leech Seed is pretty useful here, so you can beat it easily enough. Although, it might actually be faster with a level 12 Charmander than a level 12 Bulbasaur. Overall though, I'd still rank Bulbasaur as better than Charmander for this fight, so the ranking is Squirtle, Bulbasaur, Charmander. The next gym leader is Misty, the water-type gym leader. Your starter probably evolved before you entered the gym, so I'll rank the middle forms here. Charmeleon is the worst of the 3 because water-type moves do bonus damage against the fire-type, but reduce damage against the grass-type and the water-type. And these opponents' water-type moves just do too much against Charmeleon. Misty's AI doesn't use water-type moves against Wartortle or Ivysaur, and instead uses Tackle, and Wartortle's defense is better than Ivysaur's. Also, the TM for Dig is available in the same city as Misty's gym, and even though the grass-type move Vine Whip is super effective against water-type Pokemon, it is so weak that Dig actually does more damage than Vine Whip. And Wartortle can learn Dig, but Ivysaur can't. So it really might seem like Wartortle's the better choice here. The TM for Dig is also the most obvious TM in the game. Some TMs are a little bit hidden, and some are just on the ground somewhere. But the TM for Dig has an entire story event all about the TM, and if you're not using glitches or trades, you can't actually leave the city until you get the TM for Dig. But that is when you get the TM for Dig. It's when you start leaving the city. So it's quite likely that a casual player will go to the gym before they get the TM for Dig. So for a casual player, Ivysaur is better than Wartortle against this gym. I want fair comparisons, not a contrived argument for a particular starter. As an example, I did not assume for absolutely no reason that you're level 13 or 14 when you battle Brock, and then pretend that Bulbasaur is the better choice just because it would know Vine Whip a little bit before Squirtle learns Water Gun. So I ranked the starters fairly for the first 2 gyms, but then it's a bit more complicated. The order of the gyms becomes mostly your choice after this, although I would recommend Surge next, since that's the easiest remaining gym leader, and you'll already be around the right location if you do the game kind of normally, and it gives you a badge boost for defense, which is nice, and lets you use fly outside of battle, which is very useful. So, okay, Surge is probably the next gym leader you go to. Surge is the electric type gym leader. Ground type moves deal bonus damage against electric Pokemon, and Dig is the most obvious TM, and it's the strongest move you'll realistically have at this point in the game, and it's a ground type move. So it's really good against this gym. Wartortle and Charmeleon can learn Dig, but Ivysaur can't. Okay, so let's compare Wartortle to Charmeleon. Charmeleon is significantly better against this gym because the better base speed stat might matter here, and electric type moves deal bonus damage against the water type Wartortle. Ivysaur resists electric moves, but doesn't have as good options for damage, so I'll rank it between Charmeleon and Wartortle. The order is Charmeleon, Ivysaur, Wartortle. The next gym that you will encounter is Erika's gym. And you could go here next. If you do, and you didn't battle a bunch of extra trainers or wild Pokemon, you likely will still have a Wartortle or a Charmeleon, but because Ivysaur evolves into Venusaur a little earlier, you likely would have a Venusaur here. Erika's AI also would act super confused against a Venusaur, and the Victreebel and Vileplume basically don't do anything to you, so only the Tangela can actually attack you, which isn't too scary. So I would definitely rank Venusaur as the best against this gym. Grass-type moves deal reduced damage against Charmeleon and increased damage against Wartortle. So you might think that Wartortle would be worse here, but Erika's AI responds to this and uses Poison Powder and Wrap way more against Charmeleon, and the combination of Poison Powder and Wrap is really dangerous. It still might be a little bit worse for Wartortle, but let's think about this offensively. Charmeleon will be stuck with Ember because the level requirement for Flamethrower is ridiculous. And Wartortle can use the Ice Beam TM and is much stronger offensively here. Yeah, so Wartortle is better against this gym. But I don't actually recommend that you go here fourth if you have a Wartortle or a Charmeleon. I recommend that you do this gym 6th or 7th, and then you'll have a Blastoise or a Charizard. And you beat them in a single hit with Ice Beam, so Blastoise is better. The ranking is Venusaur, Blastoise, Charizard. If you only think about the first 4 gym leaders and ignore the rest of the game, you might think that Bulbasaur is the best starter. I just want to remind you that Bulbasaur is so bad against regular trainers that it's still the worst choice for the part of the game until this point, and it'll just be worse from here. It's the worst choice against every remaining gym leader. Starting with Koga, the next gym leader I'd recommend you go to. It's the Poison type gym leader. Dig is super effective against poison Pokemon. Venusaur doesn't learn Dig. Blastoise and Charizard can learn Dig. So Venusaur is the worst against this gym, and it's really close for Blastoise and Charizard, but I think Blastoise's better defense stat makes it slightly better than Charizard here. So the order is Blastoise, Charizard, Venusaur. However, I should mention something weird about this gym. Most gyms, the gym leader is the strongest trainer in the gym. In this gym, the strongest trainer in the gym is just one of the others that has a Psychic type Pokemon. Well, Venusaur is still the worst because Psychic types are strong against Venusaur. The strongest Psychic types you encounter in this gym are Hypnos, which actually have a pretty okay defense stat, and Blastoise should already know Surf, but Charizard might not know Flamethrower yet. So I would consider Blastoise still the best choice against this gym as a whole. So the ranking is Blastoise, Charizard, Venusaur. I'd recommend that you go to Blaine's gym next. Blaine is the fire-type gym leader, so the water-type Blastoise does really well here with Surf. And Charizard can do pretty well since ground-type is also super effective against fire. And Venusaur does absolutely terrible here since grass-type is bad against fire-type. So the ranking is Blastoise, Charizard, Venusaur. The next gym leader is Sabrina, the Psychic-type gym leader. Psychic-type moves deal bonus damage against a Venusaur, but not against Blastoise or Charizard. Also, Psychic-type Pokemon mostly have a really good special stat, but a bad defense stat, so you want a strong physical move. And Blastoise and Charizard learn better physical moves, including Dig, which is a really strong physical move that Venusaur doesn't learn. Yeah, so Venusaur is the worst option against this gym. Okay, but which is better, Blastoise or Charizard? Well, Blastoise has a better defense base stat, which doesn't really help much here since it doesn't protect against special moves. And it's a water-type Pokemon, which doesn't really provide any real benefit. And Charizard has a better speed stat. It's a fire-type Pokemon, and it can learn the move Slash, which is a strong physical move. So Charizard seems better. Like, you could use Flamethrower against the Venomoth, which is a negligible advantage compared to Blastoise. No, the real reason Charizard is better here is this Alakazam. It's a really fast Pokemon, and Charizard's better speed stat means it's pretty likely that Charizard will be faster than Alakazam, but a Blastoise is slower than Alakazam. Also, this Alakazam knows the move Reflect, which could be a bit of a problem for a Blastoise. But Charizard knows the move Slash, which is a critical strike move, and critical strikes ignore Reflect. Yeah, so Charizard is really good here. The ranking of the 3 Pokemon against this gym is Charizard, Blastoise, Venusaur. The last gym leader is Giovanni, the ground-type gym leader. Blastoise is the best against this gym of the 3 options since water moves are super effective against all of Giovanni's Pokemon, and Blastoise has the best defense stat of the 3 options, and Giovanni's Pokemon use physical moves, not special moves. Against this Dugtrio, Charizard is actually your best option of the 3 since Dugtrio's defense and hit points are terrible, but its speed is really good, so you beat it in a single hit with any of them, and Charizard's better speed stat might matter there. Okay, but I still think Blastoise is the best overall because it's so good against the rest of Giovanni's Pokemon. However, even though Grass is super effective against ground, it's not actually that good against the Nidoqueen and Nidoking, since they're both ground poison types, and poison resists grass. But Blastoise is still fine here since water moves deal bonus damage, but grass isn't so great here. You know what is good here? Ground moves. Ground moves deal bonus damage against Nidoking and Nidoqueen. So Charizard is actually better against the Nidoqueen and Nidoking. So that's 3 of Giovanni's Pokemon where Charizard is better than Venusaur. However, against the other 2, the Rhyhorn and Rhydon, Venusaur is better than Charizard. Since grass moves are really good against Rhyhorn and Rhydon, although Charizard would be fine here since ground moves still deal bonus damage against Rhyhorn and Rhydon. So the ranking is Blastoise, Charizard, Venusaur. The next group of special trainers are located on the Indigo Plateau and must be battled in a specific order unless you use glitches. They're called the Elite Four, but I counted them. There are 5 trainers. I wonder which one is not elite. The first member of the Elite Four is Lorelie, the Ice and Water type trainer. Now, you might think that Charizard could be good here, because Fire is super effective against Ice, but because the Pokemon are combined Ice and Water type, and water resists fire, fire doesn't actually deal bonus damage against most of them, with one exception that doesn't really matter much. Fire moves do actually deal bonus damage against Jinx, but Jinx's defense stat is so much worse than its special stat that a strong physical move is quite good against Jinx anyway. Also, water moves deal bonus damage against Charizard, and ice moves deal bonus damage against Charizard. So Charizard's actually the worst option against Lorelei. Now let's compare Blastoise and Venusaur. Blastoise is a water-type Pokemon, and the enemy understands that ice and water moves would do reduced damage, so they just won't use them. The practical effect of this is Blastoise is actually very bulky for this battle, that Blastoise does a really good job of surviving here. But Blastoise doesn't really have particularly great moves for damage in this battle. Blastoise does complete this the most consistently of the three options if you use items in battle. If you don't use items in battle, you don't do enough damage, and you might spend too many power points, and because you don't go to a Pokemon Center between Elite Four members, that could be a real problem. Okay, but what about Venusaur? Venusaur is a Grass-type Pokemon, so Ice-type moves deal bonus damage against Venusaur, which could be a problem, but Venusaur knows Grass-type moves, and Grass-type moves deal bonus damage against the Water-type Pokemon, so Venusaur actually does really well here. The only opponent that is not a Water-type in this battle is Jinx. And Jinx is the Pokemon with terrible defense but okay special, so you actually just want a physical move against Jinx anyway. If you use items in battle, like a bunch of X attacks, Blastoise is probably better than Venusaur here. But if we're considering items, let's assume that you have a big stack of revives, so if your Venusaur faints, you can just bring it back. I think overall, Venusaur is better. So the order is Venusaur, Blastoise, Charizard. The next trainer is Bruno, and I suspect this is the reason they're not called the Elite Five. Bruno is not an elite trainer. Anyway, this is an easy battle, but Bruno has two Onixes, and Onix can use a rock move that's 4 times super effective against Charizard, and Charizard doesn't have the greatest options offensively, but Blastoise and Venusaur both do amazing against Onix with a grass move or a water move. And against the other Pokemon, they're fighting types, so Blastoise is the worst against them because it does not resist fighting type moves, but Venusaur and Charizard both do resist fighting type moves. So I'd rank them as Venusaur the best, then Blastoise, then Charizard for this battle. The next member of the Elite Four is Agatha, the Poison and Ghost type trainer. Venusaur doesn't know any particularly good damaging moves for this battle. Maybe you could use Mimic on something. But Sleep is useful. However, I still think Venusaur is the worst of the three options because Blastoise and Charizard both can learn Dig, and ground moves deal bonus damage against poison types. Okay, but which is better? I think it's Blastoise because Blastoise can learn ice moves, which deal bonus damage against the Golbat, the only one you don't want to use a ground move against. Okay, the ranking for this battle is Blastoise, then Charizard, then Venusaur. The next member of the Elite Four is Lance, the Dragon and Flying type trainer. Lance's first Pokemon is a Gyarados. And Gyarados is a really strong water-type Pokemon that knows the move Hydro Pump, a really strong water move. This is absolutely terrible for Charizard, and just this is enough that I'd rank Charizard as the worst for this battle. Okay, but which is better, Blastoise or Venusaur? That's actually pretty close. But which is better, Blastoise or Venusaur? Well, against the Gyarados, Blastoise probably does less damage since Venusaur can use grass moves like Razor Leaf. But Blastoise also has a better defense stat, which could really matter in this battle. So that's close to a tie. But for the battle as a whole, you might think that Blastoise would be really good, and it is, since Ice moves deal bonus damage against the Dragon-type Pokemon. But the Dragon Pokemon also don't attack a Venusaur. The AI is just really bad and they just don't attack. So Venusaur is kind of just better by default since it's completely safe. The only exception is Aerodactyl, which is not a dragon type and will actually attack a Venusaur, but just one Pokemon, I still think Venusaur is the better choice for this battle. And this is not something that requires a bunch of planning. It'll just happen even if you don't know about it. Venusaur could get some trouble with power points if you don't plan for it, since Venusaur doesn't do particularly great damage against Dragon-type Pokemon. And Venusaur also does significantly worse against the Aerodactyl, since Blastoise just uses Surf, which does bonus damage against the Rock-type Aerodactyl. But I still think for the battle as a whole, since 3 of the Pokemon won't attack a Venusaur, Venusaur is the better choice. So my rating is Venusaur, then Blastoise, then Charizard. The next member of the Elite Four is your rival. This is the last member of the Elite Four. And I just want to remind you, there was 5 trainers here. Let's count them. Loralee, 1. Bruno, 2. Agatha, 3. Lance, 4. Rival, 5. That's 5 trainers. And they're called the Elite Four. Yeah, one of them's not elite, and I'm pretty sure that I was right. It's Bruno. Let's review how the rival battles work. The rival picks different Pokemon depending upon which starter you chose. So it's partly about which starter does the best against the rival, but it's also partly about which rival's team is the weakest. For the first 4 rival battles, the only difference of the rival's team is which starter they chose. And Bulbasaur is the worst starter, so the rival gets the weakest team if you chose a Squirtle. Although for the first 2 rival battles, since Charmander is so much stronger than the other starters, it's easiest if you pick a Charmander. For rival battles 5, 6, and 7, they add Pokemon to their team so they have a Fire type, a Water type, and a Grass type. And the Fire type they would add is a Growlithe, the Grass type they would add is an Execute, and the Water type they would add is a Gyarados. Gyarados is way stronger than the others, so the rival battles will be easiest if you pick a Charmander as your starter because they get the starter, the Wartortle or Blastoise, instead of the Gyarados. But it's even more extreme than that. Your rival's Venusaur knows the move Razor Leaf, and your rival's Charizard knows the move Slash. But your rival's Blastoise doesn't learn such good moves until the final battle. So for rival battles 5, 6, and 7, they are definitely the easiest if you picked a Charmander. For the final rival battle, your rival gets fully evolved Pokemon. Like the Rhyhorn they had in the 7th rival battle, well, in the 8th rival battle, they have a Rhydon, which is still a total wimp and not a problem. But, depending upon which starter you chose, your rival might have a Growlithe in the previous rival battles, and now they have an Arcanine for the final rival battle. And if your rival had an Execute in the previous battles, then for this final rival battle, they would have an Executor. Now, if we compare Gyarados, Arcanine, and Executor, it's closer to an equal comparison. So, the thing that actually determines which is the weakest team is probably their fully evolved starter, the Venusaur, Blastoise, or Charizard. They mostly know the moves that species would get from levels, except they know one TM move instead of one of their other moves. The Charizard knows Fire Blast instead of Flamethrower, probably the smallest difference of the 3. The Venusaur knows Mega Drain instead of Sleep Powder, and Mega Drain is a much worse move than Sleep Powder, so the Venusaur's only good move is Razor Leaf. And the Blastoise knows Blizzard instead of Skull Bash, and that makes Blastoise much stronger than it would otherwise be. This final rival battle is easiest if you're using a Blastoise, then if you're using a Charizard, and hardest if you're using a Venusaur. But if you're not using your starter anymore, I'd actually change the rankings. If you chose a Charmander, that gives the rival their strongest team for the final battle, although a much weaker teams for the previous 3 battles. If I summarize my previous comparisons, it's assuming that you use your starter and not any other Pokemon for the battles, and you also don't get a bunch of extra levels, but just kind of rush through the main story, Bulbasaur is definitely the worst of the 3 starters, and then Charmander, and then Squirtle would be the best. But that's just one specific playstyle. What if we assume that you get way too many levels for your Pokemon? Just battle a bunch of wild Pokemon in every available trainer. If that's how you play, the only battle that's a bit difficult is the first rival battle, and Bulbasaur is the worst for that battle. And after that, every other battle should be easy because your Pokemon's way stronger than your opponent's, and you should beat every opponent's Pokemon with a single hit of a good damaging move. So the important comparison is with Bulbasaur, well, eventually it becomes a Venusaur with Razor Leaf, a 95 accuracy move, which is worse than the 100 accuracy moves that you would have with a Blastoise or a Charizard. And if you're already beating opponents in a single hit, accuracy is the relevant comparison. Okay, so I know if I started with this, it would not be a fair comparison that Bulbasaur is the worst. But I just want to acknowledge that I was being a bit generous with the type of comparison I used at the start. That for other playstyles, Bulbasaur is even more worse than the other 2. You might notice that I'm showing the first rival battle, and I'm winning with a Bulbasaur. But I also got really good luck in this battle. If the way you play the game is just get a bunch of levels so you make every battle super easy, it's a really close comparison for Charmander and Squirtle. It's almost tied, but Bulbasaur is definitely the worst with that playstyle. What if you put your starter away after a while and play with another Pokemon? Then Bulbasaur is the worst choice because it gives your rival their strongest teams. But it's actually worse than just that. Bulbasaur is the worst against the beginning of the game, which is the only part you would actually play using your starter if that's the way you play. Charmander would be the best for this playstyle, since it's the best at the beginning of the game and just beats the bug catcher trainer so much faster than a Bulbasaur does, and still faster than a Squirtle would. And Squirtle would be the second best for this playstyle, and Bulbasaur is the worst. Again, for the playstyle of you put your starter away and start using another Pokemon pretty early in the game. Maybe you think that I was assuming the player knows too much about the game. Okay, what if we assume the player doesn't know very much about the game? So they'll just accidentally run into trainers since they don't know where they're located, and maybe they also don't know about any TMs and don't even teach their Pokemon the good HM moves, even though those HMs are required for the game anyway. And let's assume this hypothetical player also doesn't know which types of moves are good against which types of Pokemon. Well, they might do something like this. They might use a move like Leech Seed against a Grass-type Pokemon, where it doesn't do anything. Grass-type Pokemon generally learn more complicated moves than Water or Fire types, and Bulbasaur is a little bit of an exception, but not so much. The way it's an exception is just you get your Sleep move way later, which really just makes it worse. But really, you get a bunch of moves that do complicated things with weird interactions that you might not understand as a casual player that didn't play this game before and doesn't have a guide. You might decide that you just like regular damaging moves. Okay, then you don't get a strong normal type damaging move, and way too many things resist grass type moves. And without a strong normal type move, even if you know when you should use which is really not the hypothetical player we're talking about, Bulbasaur would be the worst of the three starters. And if you want to argue that you can get the move Body Slam with the TM, well, remember the other two can get the Dig TM. And assuming that you found the Body Slam TM but didn't find the much more obvious Dig TM, is just not a fair comparison. I would argue that Charmander is better than Squirtle for this hypothetical player because Charmander gets some good moves from levels, and Squirtle gets all its best moves from TMs and HMs, which you wouldn't get if you're the player that doesn't know that they exist. Also, choosing which move you should use with a Charizard is mostly pretty simple. Just your strongest damaging move most of the time is the right choice. So, for the player that doesn't know much about the game and didn't get a guide, but somehow can still play the game and actually progress through the story, which is not very likely, but let's just pretend this player exists, I would rank the starters in order Charmander, Squirtle, Bulbasaur. Bulbasaur still seems like the worst option, but can I make any argument for why you might ever pick a Bulbasaur? Like, can we imagine some reason that Bulbasaur would not be the worst of the three starters? Well, maybe you as a player value the more difficult battles more than the easier battles. That you think uh, the Pokemon that spends more time doing the easier battles and therefore realistically we get less levels in the same time isn't worse because those battles are easy anyway, and you just don't care about that. And the thing you care about is doing really well in the difficult Pokemon battles. Okay, this game doesn't really have difficult Pokemon battles, but the more difficult Pokemon battles. So let's think about which are the more difficult Pokemon battles. Well, the rival battles, definitely not a case where you would pick Bulbasaur for those. Well, which is the hardest other battle? Probably a gym battle. And which gym battle is kind of subjective. Let's be generous to Bulbasaur and decide you think the battle against Misty is the most difficult gym battle. So that could be some reason you would pick a Bulbasaur. So the main reason you might think that Cerulean City is the most important place, that it's the place where doing well is more important than anywhere else, is that once you enter, you're kind of stuck here. That you don't go back the way you came unless you use some glitches. But I would argue that the gym battle isn't actually the important battle, because if you beat the gym, you don't really get an immediate reward for it. You're still stuck in the city. The thing that really matters is the rival battle, and that is significantly more difficult if you're using an Ivysaur. If the gym battle against Misty is too difficult for you, you can just come back later. But if the battle against your rival is too difficult for you, you're kind of stuck. And I'm showing one solution that only works if you already planned for it before you entered the city. That you could use other Pokemon against your rival, not just your starter, but the place you catch the other Pokemon is mostly before you enter the city. So you're kind of stuck if you can't beat your rival. Sure, you can run around in the grass a little bit, but it's much easier if that's not necessary because your starter's actually good. You might notice this isn't such a difficult battle, so it's not like it's the most important thing, but I would consider the third rival battle the most important Pokemon battle in the game because you're just stuck in the city until you complete it. And sure, you're stuck until you complete a bunch of others, but like really easy battles against regular trainers are not really a place you'll likely actually be stuck. The place you might actually be stuck is here, the third rival battle. If you didn't know before you entered the city, you didn't plan carefully, you might not be ready for this battle. You might actually be stuck here. and I don't think you'll really be stuck anywhere else as a casual player. And sure, you're not completely stuck. You can definitely go run around in the grass and train your Pokemon until they're strong enough. But this is kind of the most important place you might be stuck. Which is why I think this is the more important battle where, again, Bulbasaur is the worst for the actual important stuff. It's not so terrible because the second Pokemon the rival has here is Abra, and you can heal back with Leech Seed, which wouldn't be an option for a Charmeleon or Wartortle, although those Pokemon probably just wouldn't be missing as much health since they do so much better against the first Pokemon. So I still think Ivysaur overall is worse than the others for this rival battle. The only section of the game where Ivysaur is not substantially worse than the other two starters is Rock Tunnel and the surrounding areas. But you might notice something a little bit frustrating here. As a grass type Pokemon, Ivysaur should be good against water types, but instead, the actual outcome is most water type Pokemon are somehow a little better against a grass type than you would expect. Since, some of them are dual type Pokemon, and their other type is good against a grass type. So the water routes are not actually a place where a Venusaur is reliably better than a Charizard or a Blastoise. And actually, quite often, the only reason you go to them is you want extra experience, since they're not really part of the main story. And you'll just beat all the opponent's Pokemon in a single hit with a regular move anyway. And it's again a case where that 95 accuracy of Razor Leaf makes it worse than a regular physical move that's strong enough it'll beat stuff on a water route in one hit. So yeah, this really is your best opportunity for Ivysaur being better than a Wartortle or Charizard. Another possible reason is maybe you got enough levels that you evolve your Pokemon into a Venusaur somewhere around here. If I'm being generous, I could argue that overall, an Ivysaur or Venusaur is the best of the three starter options for the section of the game from the moment you get the Cut HM until Celadon City, perhaps including most of the stuff in Celadon City. Bulbasaur is still a worse starter choice than a Charmander or Squirtle for so many other parts of the game, and Venusaur is so much worse than Blastoise or Charizard for a substantial portion of the game directly after you leave Celadon City. So, what could be the best possible argument for why you would pick a Bulbasaur? Well, you would use the Bulbasaur from the start of the game until Celadon City, and then stop using your Venusaur and use another Pokemon. And conveniently, Celadon City is where you can get Eevee, which you can evolve into some really good Pokemon. So just use that instead. As an example, you can evolve Eevee into Vaporeon, which is a really good water-type Pokemon. For comparison, Vaporeon is much better than Blastoise. It's bulkier, it does more damage. The only thing that is a little bit worse is it doesn't really do well with using physical moves, so just don't use physical moves. It's fine. And yeah, Vaporeon is better than the best fully evolved starter, which I would consider Blastoise the best fully evolved starter. And Vaporeon's better than it. So now let's rank the three starters for a casual player. I would rank Charmander as the best starter choice for a casual player, because my suggestion is put your starter in the box pretty soon and play with other Pokemon, since enough are better than all three starters, and if that's the way you play, Charmander's the best choice. Yeah, I'm not calling it the best Pokemon, just the best starter choice. Then the second best starter choice is Squirtle, because if you insist you'll actually use your starter, it's the best one that you actually want to use. And the worst starter choice is Bulbasaur. In Pokemon Red and Blue, anyway. What about the other games? Another game is Pokemon Yellow, and in Pokemon Yellow, your starter Pokemon is a Pikachu. It is way worse than the starters in Pokemon Red and Blue. Like, maybe compared to just the starters, it might not be so much worse, but they can evolve, and Pikachu's evolution requires a stone, so you get it pretty late, and it's not as good as the fully evolved versions of the starters from Red and Blue. So it's a worse starter. But that does not mean it's a worse starter choice, because which starter you choose is the same decision as which game you play. And if you believe that Pokemon Yellow is a better game than Pokemon Red or Pokemon Blue, you should conclude that Pikachu is the better starter choice. I'm not sure which game is better, so I won't decide whether Pikachu is the best or worst starter choice, but I'm pretty sure that it is not in the middle. So it's the best starter choice if Pokemon Yellow is the better game, or the worst starter choice if Pokemon Yellow is the worst game. And it's definitely not in between the other three. Anyway, the Pokemon that were starters in Red and Blue are Bulbasaur, Charmander, and Squirtle. And although they're not starters in Pokemon Yellow, they're still available in the game. So we can compare them and decide which is the most useful, middle, and then least useful in Pokemon Yellow. The order they're acquired, if you play relatively normally, is Bulbasaur, then Charmander, then Squirtle. And they're all level 10 when you get them. But Bulbasaur is not just completely free. It requires some friendship with the Pikachu before you can get the Bulbasaur. And this friendship can be earned by doing some really silly things. And it's not too long, but it is some amount of extra effort. Since level 10 is not good for when you get Bulbasaur, and Bulbasaur is not as good as other available Pokemon, you probably shouldn't use Bulbasaur as your main Pokemon. However, Bulbasaur could still be useful against Gym Leader Misty, especially the Starmie. A level 10 Bulbasaur probably won't win this fight alone, but it can use Leech Seed, which is very helpful. And the reasons you might want a Bulbasaur for this battle are, this is a relatively difficult battle for this point in the game, and most of the options for good Pokemon that you'd actually use as your main combat Pokemon are not good against Starmie. You could use a ground-type Pokemon. Nidoking, Nidoqueen, and Sandslash are all good options, but Starmie knows water moves, which deal increased damage against ground-type Pokemon. And your other good options are mostly Pokemon that use Psychic-type moves as their main source of damage, which is not good against Starmie that resists Psychic-type moves. The Charmander can be a useful HM Pokemon, since it learns Cut and Strength and Dig, and the Squirtle is basically not worth using. What about the remakes, Fire Red and Leaf Green? In these games, some things are different, and one of the biggest things that helps Bulbasaur is the level when you learn Sleep Powder. In Red and Blue and Yellow, it was way too late, but in Fire Red and Leaf Green, you learn Sleep Powder when you're level 15. That's actually practical. But sleep moves are worse in these games, because the way sleep works is a little different. It's still good though. Another change that helps Bulbasaur is they doubled the power of Leech Seed and Poison. Well, it's not the way that power works for moves, but like they do twice as much damage, and Leech Seed heals you twice as much because the healing is based upon the damage it deals. So Leech Seed is much better and actually kind of good in these games. Bulbasaur is worse as a damage dealer than Charmander or Squirtle, but this really shows the problem with Bulbasaur in Red and Blue, that the entire grass type was balanced around status moves, and then you just didn't get the good status moves in red and blue until like really late you get sleep powder, but it was just too late that it didn't matter. This might be the source of a misconception. If someone thinks that Bulbasaur is not the worst starter choice in red and blue, they're probably thinking about something from Fire Red and Leaf Green, and it's just not as good in red and blue. So maybe that's the reason that someone would ever think that Bulbasaur is not the worst starter choice in those games. If you disagree about this analysis, leave a comment. Maybe you could argue for why Bulbasaur is actually not the worst starter choice in Pokemon Red and Pokemon Blue. I don't think so, but maybe I missed something important enough that it would change the conclusion. I'm not the most familiar player with these games. Like, other players know these games way better than I do. And perhaps the reason is the first time I ever played Pokemon Red and Pokemon Blue was less than a year before the release date of this video. So if you think you know the games better than I do, maybe you do. Tell me why I'm wrong in the comments if I'm wrong. Okay, that's enough rambling. The end.